To the higher levels, like say QPSK, and you'll have a constellation diagram that looks like this, where you have four different, spaced out possibilities. And you can go to higher and higher levels. When you have this many though, obviously we can't talk about transmitting bits anymore, because there's only, for a binary option, you only have two choices. So what do we do over here? We go to what we call symbols when we have more options than bits. So for instance, maybe we would assign this to be 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1, all the possible combinations of two binary bits. And so you get to, in this case, and this I won't draw it, but you would have instead four possible different phases of sinusoid that are broadcast. And it just gets to a place where when you look at it in the time domain, it's hard to judge what's going on, because your eye can't, it doesn't do very well at seeing these little differentiating the slight differences in phase. I could double up and put four more angles on there and get more symbols, more data would be transmitted, and then I'd have to have 8 different phases. And part of what we'll do when we do the Simulink is that we'll play around with this. There'll be a PSK Simulink, and then there'll be what we call a QAM Simulink, quadrature amplitude modulation. And you'll get to play with all the levels in the Simulink program and see the trade-offs of, and so we'll talk about that when we get to the Simulink. Has anybody gotten into the Simulink at all? Tried it out? All right, 1 or 2. You'll want to get in there and make sure that your version of Simulink works with that. Just throw that block diagram together in there. And did you have any trouble with yours, or did it work?
No. I had to use it for my lecture before too, so I had to
All right, good.
Yeah.
So whatever version you had worked with that. Good. That's good news. All right. Don't leave it till the end. Try to get in there a little early. That's right, you guys are coming off, nobody's going to be doing that stuff over spring break, never mind. But you should start thinking about that now. Take my advice on that one. Word to the wise. So with BPSK, you can kind of see what's going on. So here's what we're going to do next week. And this will be a quick one too, like tonight's. Two pretty quick labs. At least the in-lab component is pretty fast. So if this is our encoded binary message like we do in here, just a half-duty cycle pulse, like a square wave, then if we multiply this, times some carrier, then the result is going to be, every time there's a change in sign, basically, a change in what we're broadcasting, and obviously it'll change the sign of the carrier, and you get a 180-degree phase flip right at that point. So if we're coming along here, right there where the sign change, instead of continuing on down here, maybe it will flip and go the other way. And then, here we got a phase change, so it'll just jump up and you get a 180-degree phase flip right there. And you'll see this on the oscilloscope next week. Kind of hard to draw. Well, you can imagine if it's kind of hard to draw with just 2 options. It's much more difficult when you have 4 or more options. Basically, you're just multiplying the carrier, whatever happens to be, by a -1, and boop, it just flips, changes the other direction. Or maybe another way to think about it, as soon as the bit flips, we go from this signal to that signal. So it's not very easy to sense this. So that's why you have to use these more sophisticated techniques of tracking carrier phase. And then you can really see what's going on. But that's not trivial stuff. Phase lock loops, Costas loops, and those kinds of things. So the pre-lab that will be due next week is like a 1 to 2 page report. Just like we've done in the past, like we did for OOC. And, you know, equations, block diagrams, time and frequency domain plus, just a theory, general theory investigation, 1 to 2 pages from your comm book, online, wherever, on PSK and maybe BPSK in particular. And you get to reuse this, because it can be the intro of the report that will be due the week after. And then when we do a PSK Simulink report, just throw it in there so that you have a complete report. I want you to have a complete report. You can just reuse this a couple of times. Part of the thing that we're doing in here is learning how to write good, complete reports. Why don't we do the frequency part of this? We've done this enough times in here where you could probably do it yourself. But, you know, for frequency, we know that half duty cycle pulse train, basically, without a DC offset in this case. So nothing here at 0, but then we're gonna have, you know, 1 and then a null. So we'll have every other one will be a null. It'll just be our HD sync ND. Every other one a null. So that's what our data stream spectrum is going to look like. And then we, of course, can ball, once again, with a high frequency carrier, double spikes, and then sifting theorem will once again give us our old familiar spectrum here. That HD sync ND pulse train spectrum, or some kind of a sync function, plus or minus the carrier. So we see this an awful lot, don't we? For different situations. So that's the pair that we're going to have with this. But when you notice that for phase modulation, you just don't really have much information in the spectrum. You can see where the power lies in the signal, but there's no phase information right here. On the spectrum analyzer, it's gone. You can't look at this and know that this is what's going on. So this is just the way phase information is. Another illustration of why we need to track carrier phase to really know what's going on with our signal. Because just looking at the spectrum alone does not give us the details of that time domain signal. If we did BPSK or QPSK, we'd get the same thing over here, wouldn't we? We wouldn't know, because the phase information just isn't there. So we'll see this next week when we do the PSK, the BPSK part of the lab 10. Any questions before we talk about tonight? These modulation schemes are used heavily. Like at JPL, most of the contact with the spacecraft are using these modulation schemes up until maybe 10 years ago, where started branching into more sophisticated stuff. GPS used BPSK, QPSK until the modernization effort recently. So these were used a lot, up until maybe 10 years ago, and you'll still see it some, depending on the system. All right. Let's talk about tonight. Like I said, tonight goes